The year is 2003, and you just got faced. Welcome to the Pod People, the show where we have pod fever. I'm Matisse Van Rossum, and I'm covered in fox piss. And all the foxes from the community are coming down presently.
To get you. Well, I'm Ben, and I absolutely love pancakes.
Hi, I'm Cleveland Mosier, and I was floating near the tropic moon and dreaming of a blue lagoon, and now I'm crazy as a loon.
All right, well, we can tell who the cabin fever is getting to the most.
Yeah. I'm really disappointed that no one went with, I'm a PhD of being a dog.
Yeah, well,
that is
only
a good one,
Piglet is a professor of being a dog, so I didn't want to steal her thunder.
That is
but
true. Good old classic Piglet. Do y'all know what song I was sampling there?
No.
You didn't recognize that one-off bit from the legendary hit Cabin Fever from Muppet Treasure Island?
Nope.
Nope.
Oh, well, that's what it was from. There you go. A score written by Hans Zimmer, as a matter of fact.
Well, we learn many things every day, and what we have learned this week is that cabin fever is real. How many days has it been since we've been quarantined at this here lighthouse? Ben, this week was your pick. And
Yes.
You picked something
Relevant.
topical.
Yes, very topical.
Thematic, even.
I picked maybe my favorite pandemic horror movie especially, Cabin Fever. It's a little movie by Eli Roth, who, of course, went on to direct things like Hostel. But this is my favorite movie by him.
Mine too.
It starts almost generic. Bunch of college kids go to a cabin in the woods. Who knows what crazy things are gonna happen? And then
horror adjacent things.
It escalates to batshit crazy.
That's right. And
Yes.
I think anything else is hard to say without spoiling.
Well,
sure.
as you said, this is Eli Roth's directorial debut from 2003. Oh, I forgot to mention.
He also wrote, produced, and was a co-star in this movie.
Yes.
2 roles in this movie, actually.
all of those things. I forgot to mention who else the movie stars. Forgot to do my job. It does have Ryder Strong
Of Boy Meets World.
Yep. Jordan Ladd, James DeBello, Serena Vincent, and Joey Kern, and a whole other cast of kooky characters.
Yes.
This is also definitely my favorite Eli Roth film.
Might be mine. Too.
I like Hostel a lot as well, but I think he really peaked with his first film. As I mentioned briefly on the podcast last week, this is one of my favorite modern horror satire films because I think it's a really, really strong example of like how to satirize a genre without like being too on the nose.
It's not terribly tongue-in-cheek, which I really appreciate. You know, like, it gets absurdist and silly, but it's never pointing to itself and like being
Exactly.
like, see, we know what we're joking about.
It's absolutely a hyperbole of the genre without ever being like nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Aren't we so clever?
Yeah, there's never any like breaking of the fourth wall
No.
or anything of that sort. It's just good gags.
Yeah, extremely good gags. This is a very funny movie. One of the funniest horror movies ever, I think. I've seen this movie a bunch of times, and I always laugh at the same gags every time.
Yeah,
So-
there's some great ones.
Just to give a sense of how little I knew about this film going into it, I thought this film was from the 70s.
What?
Interesting.
I knew literally nothing, and when you hear a title like Cabin Fever associated with like someone I would have thought would have been a young director at the time, I don't even know who Eli Roth was in this film. I don't know how old Eli Roth is.
He was grim. He was
Grim the stoner guy.
Oh
The
wow,
stoner
yeah,
guy,
well,
yeah.
definitely wasn't of age to be directing films in the 70s.
no,
for sure.
I don't even think he was alive in the 70s.
He wouldn't have been. No, excellent. But no, you hear a title like Cabin Fever. Y'all were using the words pandemic and craziness and stuff, and it was just evoking floating imagery of like reefer madness and stuff in my head, because that's how little I knew about this film. I didn't know when it came out. I didn't know anything about it. So it was a real delight finding out that no, it was shot in like 2002. And what
I'm
fun.
so fascinated to pick your brain about this movie, Cleveland, because you knew nothing going in.
Zero.
And this movie is full of just wild left turns.
Stuff that you would never, ever see coming. I'm jealous that I didn't get to watch this movie for the first time again tonight.
Well, I think we should just go ahead and just say spoilers from here on out.
mean,
It's
yeah,
impossible to talk about it.
The movie's
I
almost
can't
20
even talk
years old,
like
too.
adjacently about it without spoiling anything. And
Yeah.
I think it shouldn't be spoiled. Like, if you're still not familiar with anything about this film, then go check it out. Like, it's delightful. I had a
Yes.
great time with it, not knowing anything
There's
going in.
never been a better time
And
to
if you-
watch it than now.
And if you know the premise, I think it would still be very funny. Like, I don't think that affects it necessarily, but it definitely adds a little extra fun zhuzh, little spice.
Well, what I love about the title of this movie, Cabin Fever, is that it's pretty much nothing more than a pun, because it doesn't actually relate to the actual concept of cabin fever, of being locked up in a place so long you go crazy. It's just a virus movie that takes place in a cabin.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the first thing I have to bring up is how much of a debt the film Tucker and Dale versus Evil owes this movie.
Yeah.
I need to go back and watch that one again. I love that film.
Yeah, I love that movie,
I
too.
love
It's
that
great.
film to bits.
See, I've never been that big on Tucker and Dale versus Evil, because pretty much for the exact reason that you just said.
Yeah,
is that,
as you
like,
saw Cabin Fever
I saw
first.
Cabin Fever first, but that's interesting. Like, Ben, you love both.
Yeah, I love both. I think they do different things. I think Tucker and Dale is much more directly tongue-in-cheek.
Yes.
And, I think the differentiator is really the outbreak itself in Cabin Fever.
What I like about both of them that can nicely be said with a little bow is that the villain or the monster of both those films is idiocy.
Yes.
Yes,
Like,
absolutely.
yeah.
And
And I love that. I love that two
yeah,
bits.
and I would argue that both movies owe a bit of a debt to, like, Deliverance, for example.
Deliverance,
Sure.
Evil Dead, fucking
Any
Friday,
cabin-related horror film.
Friday the
you know.
13th. I mean, that is what Cabin Fever is satirizing, is like those kinds of films. And I think that another film that is a sort of direct result of Cabin Fever is Cabin in the Woods.
Yes.
Which we haven't talked about yet, but will at some point. But like, similarly to Dark City, you can see the things that influence this film and also see the films that it has influenced. And also similarly to Dark City, I feel like Cabin Fever is kind of underappreciated in the canon.
I would totally agree.
Like-
It has a bit of a cult status, but, like, not enough that it deserves, Like, I think it got middling reviews when it was released. It gets middling reviews sometimes now.
Yeah.
And it's one of those movies where I think deserves way more than it gets credit for.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think even when you hear like horror fans talk about Cabin Fever a lot of the times, it's like, yeah, it's pretty funny, it's good. But it's like, I feel like that's such an understatement. Like, I truly feel like Cabin Fever is high art in its own weird way.
And I think it does a lot of smart things, too. Like, the way it handles misdirection is great. One great example of that is, like, the first night. Obviously, you see some of the infection early on. But when they're sitting around the bonfire and he's telling the story about the bowling alley guy.
the bowling alley
and-
massacre,
Yeah, and you get some fun sequences with that, with like bowling limbs and stuff. But it almost serves as a bit of a red herring of, this guy went crazy. So you don't expect the disease quite as much.
Well, yeah, it's like in stuff like Friday the 13th, where like the dumb teenagers are sitting around the campfire telling a story about like a killer who went crazy, and then the killer shows up and kills them. It's like they're setting that up in the same kind of way, and then somebody does show up, but it's just Eli Roth as like a like stoner skater dude with a little soul patch.
Grim.
Grim, yes, with his dog Dr. Mambo.
Which one of my favorite jokes in the movie.
Yeah, he's a professor
It's one of the best, easily, for sure.
of being a dog.
Faced. He does this thing where he pulls his hand in front of his face and just says face.
It's one of those
so unironically, and I love it.
So early aughts, it's amazing. Like he's got the soul patch and he's got like the surfer bruh accent. Absolutely incredible. Which I did want to key into real quick. Much like Dark City, for very different reasons, I see this film, or at least I perceive this film as a lovely time capsule.
Yes.
Like it is like they're constantly like saying that things are gay and making all sorts of like very not like the face thing.
Well, it
and
was-
like all those like very very like early 2000s.
It's like the
late
kind of
90s.
it's like the kind of jokes that Fred Durst tried to write into The Fanatic
This
but,
year.
but like last year.
Yeah,
It's the kind
in
of stuff.
2019.
It has almost a Mad TV sensibility, you could say.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like on the subject of this film being sort of underappreciated, this film is basically like the sole reason that I will defend Eli Roth to the death anytime anybody tries to say that he's a bad filmmaker. Like, he's made some fucking duds, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Like, Green Inferno was not great.
His Death Wish was kind of.
I never saw that.
But like this, and I would argue the Hostel movies,
yeah.
you know.
But like, I can even understand people not liking Hostel, like if you're not into torture porn or that kind of stuff or that level of gratuity. I can at least sort of tolerate criticisms of that. But like, if you try to say fucking Eli Roth is a bad director, like this movie is fucking
It's
amazing.
great, yeah.
Yeah, like there are a number of elements about like the editing and the framing of it that did feel very artificial, but I think that in such a kooky film, it fits great. Like it fits like a glove even. Like it's that wacky sort of sensibility and the very like cleanly framed elements. Like this movie is not naturalistic in any way.
No.
And
no.
I think in this case, like it made the jokes land a little bit better and the gore and the violence and stuff be a little bit easier to approach comedically.
You bring up the film being sort of like a time capsule for, you know, the era in which it was made, and I agree. I think something fun to note is that this movie came out the same year as The Descent, and we watched that a couple of weeks ago and talked about like how The Descent has aged. And I think that that's an interesting topic to bring up in this case too, because
I
they're
think
very,
it's
very
a
different
weird thing
films.
to say, but I actually think this movie has aged. I might prefer how this movie has aged to The Descent, and I love both. I love The Descent, and I think visually it's extraordinary. Listen to the episode about it. Like I gush about it as well. But I really liked the color correction in this film. Those elements of it like felt less dated to me. And there are several shots that are just gorgeous too in this movie. And The Descent as well, but like so much of The Descent is like so color graded for like the early 2000s and like just really like the visually like feels like the early 2000s to me. This film didn't
And I
necessarily
think
take
on
that
top
road.
of that, this movie kind of plays off of tropes of early 2000s horror.
Totally.
You know, late 90s, early 2000s horrors. So I feel like the artificiality and kind of the datedness feels like it has intention to it almost.
There's
so
intent there,
I
yeah.
give it more of a pass than I would if it was just like a straight-faced, you know,
Absolutely.
horror
Well,
with these elements.
I think that I'm actually in kind of the opposite camp to you, Cleve. I think that this movie is far more dated than The Descent, but in this case, I don't think dated is a bad thing. I think for the exact reason you said, Ben, it's like it has a degree of campiness, and as a satire already, it kind of like distills those tropes of late 90s, early 2000s horror in such a way that it is like a perfect time capsule, to use that term again, of that era. Whereas The Descent is like, there's certain things about it that are dated, but ultimately I think it's aged very well in the sense that like its horror and its storytelling is pretty timeless. It doesn't feel like, it's so 2000s. But like this movie is like, oh, it's so 2000s.
Yeah, and it plays off of archetypes of, you know, the Cabin in the Woods type of movie. In the same way that the actual movie Cabin in the Woods does. You know, you have your archetypal frat bro and pretentious, you know, kind of douchebag character.
I think where this film really differs from Cabin in the Woods is where Cabin in the Woods takes the tropes and makes them so over exaggerated that they're caricatures. I think this movie takes the tropes and starts to lure you into sort of a false sense of security, and then turns the tropes on their head. There's a lot of subversion in this movie, even it, like, not necessarily narrative subversion, but just like it's hard to anticipate what is coming. It's very unpredictable in so many ways.
Yes. And I think the false sense of security is a great thing to point out, because, like, even with the casting of, like, Ryder Strong as the main character, you know, his big break was Boy Meets World. He's a very, you know, child star actor. You know, usually those kind of actors do kind of generic horror in their pivot.
Yeah.
So it does bring a false sense of security with that, too, even with the casting.
Well, he's even established as like kind of a quiet, sensitive boy type.
Virginal, like, almost.
Yeah, virginal. His other two male friends call him a pussy. Like, they set him up to be kind of like the hero, but rather he definitely does not stay a pussy for the entire movie, but it kind of goes in the other direction, where rather than like becoming heroic and saving the day, he just becomes sort of like outwardly violent, and just like his incompetence just sort of skyrockets. His ability to handle every situation is just kind of shut down completely.
Well, it's a whole play like toxic masculinity. Like the other two guys are like just generally like toxic shitheads to begin with. Yeah, bros. Hence them calling him a pussy and stuff, just for like being like a reasonable person, you know. And like the other two guys have like either brought their girlfriend, like the other guy like brought his girlfriend, you know, and whatnot. And like
Jeff
the other guy just came along.
And Bert is just there drinking and getting high. He's like he's the typical stoner archetype. And even he kind of like subverts that archetype as well, as being like one of the only ones who tries to sort of take agency in the movie, even though he's a total asshole about it.
Right. He's not, well, like, he's worse than worthless. He takes a lot of action. He just takes horrible action all the time. And yeah, so this subversion is
that's kind of active. Thematic in this film, though, is like everything, all the characters are marked by their complete incompetence.
Yeah, and narcissism too. You know, they just evolve immediately into only caring about their own survival.
Right.
In a similar way to Tucker and Dale versus Evil, in that, like, in this immediate moment of crisis, they all just evolve into being total awful people.
Yes. Rather than in horror films where usually you expect them to band together to try to fight the outside force. But in this case, it's like, nope, they totally, completely turn on self-interest.
And to bring that back around to our focal character, you know, he's come up to the cabin with his childhood friend, you know, who of course he's had a crush on. It's the girl next door, you know, situation. And so like we see them sort of like flirting with each other, you know, on and off. It's, you know, your usual fare.
But he's too cowardly to like really make a move.
Yeah, he's a nice guy, kind of. It's a nice guy situation, really, is what it comes down to. Very early 2000s.
Except when it's not.
Yes, except for when it is not. But it's really framed that way to begin with, for its favor. Like, it's definitely a point of commentary on nice guys, I think, which is very productive. Like, it's good. It's a good thing to talk about, especially in 2002
for the time, I think.
Yeah, like this film is holding a spotlight on like the era it's born out of. It embraces that early aughts vibe hard, and I love that about it. Like, because it's self-aware, it gets away with it.
Another interesting point about his sort of relationship with Karen, the girl next door type, is in this kind of movie, you would expect that, like, throughout the film, they're the two who survive, like, they band together, they have the closest bond, and like through the crisis, you know, he gains her love by the end of it, and you know, they are brought together through their shared trauma. But Nope. No. She's the first one out of all of them who gets the virus. And like, what do? They take her and lock her out in the shed because they don't want to be near her and basically just leave her out there to die.
I love the subversion of there actually being like a good number of people nearby.
Yes,
like, they're not out in the middle of nowhere.
Every time they go to someone nearby, it goes drastically wrong, though.
Always literally the worst.
Yeah,
because of their own incompetence.
Yes,
and stupidity.
absolutely.
Yeah.
They go to this like farmer, I guess, and she's like
she's a pig farmer.
Yeah, she's cutting open this pig when we first see her. And she's just screaming at it.
You think I'm gonna eat this sick pig? Yeah, kind of stuff.
Or the moment where they go to the house next door and Ryder Strong is like looking through the window at like a sexy lady.
He starts like peeping on a woman undressing, and then her husband comes outside with the shotgun.
As he should.
And then when he tries to say like, "Hey, my friend is sick, we need help," he just looks like a peeping Tom.
Mm-hmm. Well, because he says, "Hey, my friends are sick," and he's like, "You're sick, bud.
Right.
Get the fuck out of here."
Well,
which is also a fun play on toxic masculinity.
Yes.
In the same way.
Well, yeah, and also like that horrible trope of like peeping in movies and it being all right.
It's like yeah, if you were really if you're really concerned about the situation, like you run straight up to the door and knock on the door and ask for help. But like no, instead you take a second to stop and like watch a woman undress. And like to go back to the pig farmer, the reason they fuck that up is because after they sort of like win her favor, she takes them in the house and they start trying to tell her what happened, and they see a picture of the homeless guy who first brought the disease to the cabin that they set on fire because they wouldn't help him. Selfishly.
I love the scene where they set him on fire as well. Just to mention, like, that came out of incompetence as well. Like,
Absolutely.
One of them is, like, shooting bug spray at him.
While Ryder Strong has a torch from the fire. But yeah, they find out that the hobo that they've set on fire is the pig farmer's cousin, so they leave rather than tell her that they accidentally set her cousin on fire. So that's one person who they could have gotten help from, nothing. The other one, like you said, the guy the guy whose wife Ryder Strong peeps on. And then when like they finally do find somebody who's actually willing to help them, it's Deputy Winston, one of my favorite characters, but also wildly incompetent.
Yes.
That's what makes him so great.
Deputy Winston is definitely one of my favorite characters. He's played by Giuseppe Andrews, who was the lead subject of one of my favorite documentaries on filmmaking, actually, called Giuseppe Makes a Movie. After this movie, like a decade after, he was living in trailer parks, getting all his neighbors to star in his $300 budget movies. He made like 20 movies a year. Really bizarre guy.
Sort of a Mark Burchard type.
Yes, very much so. But he kills it in this movie. His performance is so strange and funny. I love how when Deputy Winston is first introduced, he comes up to the cabin and he sees the truck just destroyed and covered with blood, and he's completely unfazed. He's more interested in the parties nearby.
Yeah, like at first he just straight up doesn't even notice the truck covered in blood. He's like so like excited. He's like, oh my god, new people like my age to hang out with in this small shitty town. His whole bit about like how the people up in like some like northwestern town or whatever.
The neighboring town.
Yeah, like up in the neighboring town, like how they really love to party, you know, and you can tell it's a population of like 200.
Yeah.
It's
He's
amazing.
like, oh yeah, my cousin goes up there and I go up there and party with him because I know I'm gonna get pussy every time. Like, that's the best thing about Deputy Winston, is that like he's a cop who has absolutely no business being a cop and does not present himself as a cop.
No, because like he's still like a college kid and just like looking to go out and have a good time in a small town.
Got a
like,
wispy little mustache, and he keeps calling Ryder Strong the party man. And when Karen comes out of the house to like see what's going on, he's like, "Oh, don't you worry, ma'am. Everything's under control. You just go back inside and just drink a nice big 40. Just keep on partying."
Later on, when we see him like partying with a bunch of teens.
With a bunch of underage.
Yeah, like he even like he puts in a call and they call back saying like, "Yeah, Deputy Winston, you know anything about that APB we put out about that underage drinking party?"
He's like, "Oh yeah, I still haven't found that underage drinking party." And they're like, "Well, don't worry about it. We got a more serious situation." He's partying there with his police cruiser, like still in his uniform, just like getting these kids drunk because he's just so desperate for a party. The characters in this movie, like all of the secondary characters.
Yes, all of the character actors especially just kill it.
Deputy Winston,
the shopkeeper.
Oh my god.
Oh.
We first like are introduced to the tone and the world of this movie, I would argue, with what's the kid's name?
Dennis
And the shopkeeper.
Well, Dennis.
Dennis, this very deliverance kid.
The deliverance-ist.
on the porch of the general store, and one of the main characters sits down next to him and he just reaches over and grabs his hand and bites him. There's this a whole great gag when like Dennis's dad comes out. He's like, "Everybody knows not to sit next to Dennis." They're like, "Well, maybe you should put a sign up." And then we come back to the general store later and they have put up a sign that says, "Don't sit next to Dennis." Dennis is great. The dad is great. The old shopkeeper is also one of my favorite
the
characters.
kooky old man. Yeah. Like what a wonderful like lens to put up to like folksy racism. I love the double subversion there, where he comes across as like this friendly, kooky old salesman who, you know, just wants the best for these young kids, and then they ask him like, "Well, sir, what's that gun on the wall for?" And of course he says it's for you know the
Well, they ask him what the fox piss is for first, and
yeah,
then
he says
they're
that's
like,
for foxes. Yeah,
What's the rifle for?
Yeah.
It's for
the word. And we think that the gag is just, oh, he's a friendly, folksy old man. Oh wait, no, he's a racist. And like that's as far as it goes until like the very end of the film,
the
like
last gag of the
with
movie.
this incredible subversion where like we see a group of like black friends like show up at the store, and you see him going for the gun, and you're thinking like, oh god, they're going back to this gag. You know, here it goes. And then like he turns around and everyone is smiling, and he just hands them the gun like, "Got it nice and polished up for you and everything." You know, it says the kooky old man. And,
"What's up, my..."
yeah.
Well, it's one of my favorite jokes in the movie, and I feel like it's one of those jokes that would never fly today.
It's very Blazing Saddles. It's definitely like trepidatious, and yeah, like I wouldn't put it in a film.
I mean, now,
but like
this is also, we're also talking about the era of like the Chappelle Show, and
Yes.
that gag is very Chappelle Show.
Very.
I think they even did an extremely similar gag on the Chappelle Show. At
Oh,
one
in the first
point.
episode. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
like, it's such a product of its time, but I still think it's so funny.
Yeah, it's definitely not my place to say beyond that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I feel like you wouldn't be able to do it today because no one has any sense of nuance. I think part of the reason it's so funny is it shines a light on your preconceptions of like racist Southerners and
you just
rednecks.
fully assume that the joke stops at the old like countryman is a racist.
Right, and that's why
Like,
it's such a
and-
good. That's why it's such a good bit, because then it sets it up at the very beginning and doesn't pay off until the last scene. By the time all the rest of that just absolute madness that happens in this movie, you come back to that and you've totally forgotten about it, and then the payoff is just like, God, that's such a fucking good callback. And I agree with you, Ben. I think it's a great way to like sort of be a double subversion and like shine the light on your own preconceptions about like what the joke is going to be. And that's why I think Eli Roth is a really clever writer, and I don't think he gets enough credit for that. I think there's even a lot of that shit in Hostel too.
Yeah, like especially with the guy on the train talking about like, you know, eating your food in Hostel. That is very reminiscent. That
Of course,
same
my
style
horse.
Of course, my
yeah,
horse.
the weird kooky characters, that same style of dialogue. It definitely all fits.
Hostel was only like 2 or 3 years after this movie, I think. I think
Yeah.
Hostel was Eli Roth's
This
second
came out
movie.
in 03. Saw came out in
03.
04.
The first Saw was 03.
Oh,
also.
03 as well. And then Hostel was just a couple of years after. One of the things I really want to talk about with this movie is all of the great practical effects. They really don't skimp out on the blood. They really go excessive with it at times, with people just spraying it out of their mouth.
Like exploitation kind of levels.
Yeah,
The
almost
same kind of
Evil
things-
Dead-esque.
Evil Dead, or the kind of stuff you would expect out of that era of, or just Quentin Tarantino in general, just like very over the top in the best way. Like there's no such thing as too much blood.
You know how I knew the blood sprays were coming? Early on, there's a bit where the FU hat guy, what's
Bert.
his name? Where Bert, there's a sequence early on where Bert is taking a piss out in the woods, and it's clearly via one of those tubes that
Yeah.
like spray the liquid everywhere. So I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna get some blood sprays in this movie after seeing that scene.
I love that.
There's a little bit, I guess, in the opening sequence too with the dead dog.
Oh yeah, when Henry the Hermit finds the dead dog and gets some blood sprayed on his face, and that's how he gets infected. I mean, yeah, a little bit. I think that it's pretty restrained for a while,
Yes.
and until it's not.
Till Henry starts spraying all over the inside of the car. I love all like the viscera that like is on the car later on, like after in the aftermath.
I mean, that's a funny thing about it too, is that they're all so concerned with like not catching the virus, but they're so bad at not touching stuff that is like covered in blood.
Welcome
Like, they're
to 2020.
right.
Here we are. Relevance.
Only one character in this movie does social distancing properly, and it's Jeff.
Yes, and that is a gag in itself. He goes out of his way to be super paranoid and not let anyone touch him or eat the same food out of dishes.
Including his own girlfriend, who
Yeah.
he comes there for like a romantic week with. He's great too, because he sort of like fills the archetype of like the pretty boy jock, but even so, like he's the least heroic in the movie.
Well, yeah, you immediately set him up at the general store talking about suing the
them,
dude
yeah.
for Dennis biting him, and you're like, okay, so he's this kind of douchebag.
He's like the self-assured asshole who's like gonna step in and like take command of the situation and like try to be all tough, and then like once shit starts going down, he's the opposite of that. He becomes like super prissy, like you said, extremely paranoid, walking around with a handkerchief over his mouth, not wanting to be near anybody, and then eventually he just grabs 2 6-packs of beer and goes off into the woods
Yeah.
and disappears for most
One of my
the
other
movie.
favorite parts of that too is early on they had set up that bit with him and Bert betting each other who could go the longest without drinking anything other than beer. And Bert, of course, he accidentally drinks water
And gets
that
sick.
turns out to be his downfall. But Jeff, the moment things go awry, he grabs the rest of the beer and runs off into the woods.
And I love like he's pretty much gone from the rest of the movie after that, but every now and then it'll just cut back to him in this like abandoned barn by the lake, just like drinking beer by himself.
Which also, like, those are some of the best shots in the movie. Like, that abandoned barn looks good.
I mean, scenery-wise, this
Like,
film is really nice.
yeah, when
Like,
he
they've got a
emer-
lot of really beautiful shots.
When he emerges from the barn like a babe from the womb, and the camera beautifully pans to the side, and like the setting sun is catching the edge of the abandoned barn, and like all the ivy going up the side, like it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful shot. Like they clearly like planned it out and like took a lot of extra time to get that framing perfect, and like it
they
looks lovely.
It seems like they shot a lot of this movie during like golden hour.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of the outdoor stuff is like very, very pretty.
And credit to the night sequences too. They all look great. One thing that's worth bringing up, like, is like day for night is always rough. And you can tell that I think they use like spotlights. Like
Yeah, they
at
didn't
night
do
instead
day for
they did
night,
control
no.
night light, and you can usually like you can tell there are a few sequences where there's like smoke and people's bodies are like casting shadows on the smoke around them and stuff. But like generally it looks great regardless. But the best thing about it is even though they still use spotlights at night, they don't color correct hard blue. Like as a matter of fact, they tended to go warmer. There's a few sequences like starting up the car at night and other stuff where our protagonist is wandering around and like there's actually a bit of like a nice like warming tint of color correction to it, and it looks great. It looks lovely.
Yeah, well, one of the best parts of the night sequences, especially the early one, is because fire is so openly used in it, it gives it that warmth that you would normally get of the oranges of the flames and stuff.
Yeah, it's very consistent color wise. Like you said, there's a lot of fire stuff, and then like during the day, it's all very golden and idyllic. So it's tonally consistent between the day and the night. To circle around back to Jeff real quick, because what I love about how they resolve his character is that you think he might actually be the most competent one in the movie by social distancing and just going off on his own.
Being a coward, yeah.
I mean, but also being smart. Yeah, I don't know if it's cowardly. I mean, it's out of cowardly self-interest, but it's also the smartest thing to do.
Well, to a degree. I mean, the smartest thing to do is to go out and find help from people in a competent
tried.
fashion. He tried one spot. Like there's still other people, and like you just can walk farther. Like,
well, they did go to the empty the house as well.
And steal their beef jerky.
Yeah.
But my point is that you think that he might be the only one who survived, because at the end, after everybody else is dead, he goes back to the cabin stupidly and just like see what's going on. And it's this great scene where he's walking through the house and he sees all of the blood and all of the aftermath that he has not been around for. And he starts crying, and you think it's because he's sad his friends are dead. But then he starts laughing and just screaming, "I made it. I knew I'd fucking make it. Everyone's dead but me. I knew I'd make it." And he just walks out onto the porch, and in similar fashion to Night of the Living Dead, he just gets lit the fuck up by the cops that are outside. Oh god, I love that. And like, man, even all the cops too at the end who think that they're like containing the situation are like being so blasé about how they handle the blood and the bodies, and
They're
like
just burning them.
just completely incompetent. And like Winston took Ryder Strong's character and like threw his body in the creek, like even though he had an infectious disease. And then we see the kids filling up their water tub from the creek to go make lemonade that then everybody at the end of the movie is drinking. It's just like complete incompetence across the board. Nobody is in control of anything.
I will say, like, that if there was one thing, and it's a dumb thing, it's a dumb nitpick, but like any small town would just drink well water. No one's drinking from a creek.
I mean, yeah, nobody's drinking from the creek, but
no one's drinking from a creek. Like few are that dumb and don't live long to tell if you're drinking from a creek.
Hey,
like,
but
there's
kids-
dysentery in there all.
Kids would grab crick water
This
to make
is true.
lemonade.
And if it was just that, it would be fine. But also the guy in the shop like recommends that they go down and get some water from the creek.
oh
like-
yeah. When Dennis bites Ryder Strong, Dennis's dad tells us like, there's a stream out back where you can wash your hand. It's like, why don't you just go into the general store and wash your hands in the bathroom? You know?
Yeah, just you know,
But I mean,
like you do.
It's I think that's thematically consistent. Like everybody in this movie is a fucking dunce.
Oh yeah,
Like
everyone.
it is a pandemic movie, but it's like a pandemic before the pandemic. It's like the
Yes.
story is only like patient zero and like the initial spread. Because they set it up beautifully, you know, just having all of the people from the town coming in to drink the lemonade as the credits roll. But I mean, also the hobo's body ended up in the reservoir, so it's gonna spread.
It's a very bleak ending, but
Clearly, this is a prequel to Return of the Living Dead.
No, it's a prequel to Cabin Fever 2.
Is
directed
there-
by Ty West.
Yeah, I've never seen Cabin Fever 2.
There's a sequel.
Don't.
And a third one.
There's a third one?
Yeah.
I didn't know there was a third one.
Trilogy?
Not by Eli Roth.
No, Eli Roth only did
Let's
the first
make that
one.
clear. The second one was directed by Ty West.
Did he produce?
Who
or...
has done some great movies.
Ty West has done some great movies.
But Ty West wanted to take his name off of Cabin Fever 2. Let's just say it's probably not good. I haven't seen it, but
I've never seen Cabin Fever 2, but Cabin Fever 3 came out in 2014. It's called Patient Zero, and it also stars Sean Astin. In the lead role.
What?
But what I do think is worth mentioning is that they did a remake of the original in 2016 that is, I think I listed as one of my least favorite films of the decade a few months ago. It's so strange. I remember you and I watched it back in Milwaukee, and it is absolutely awful, but it's almost a shot-for-shot remake.
Why?
Get this, though, all of the comedy is removed.
yeah.
It's a almost shot-for-shot remake done totally straight-faced, totally serious, no jokes.
But all the terrible decisions they make, that would just make them frustrating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's such a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Oh no.
It's fucking terrible.
Oh yeah, I bet it is. Like you can't just like take a comedy film, remove the comedy, then expect it to work. Bad framing like just becomes shitty framing. Like when you do that, like comedically bad and
like we've been saying, so much of what makes this movie good is how representative of the early 2000s it is,
and self-aware
and funny and like commenting on those kinds of tropes and stuff, and to take that and make the events almost identical, the shots almost identical, but totally serious to try to like modernize it and make like a scary movie. It's maybe one of the most misinformed horror film decisions in like the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I cannot say enough bad things about the remake. And honestly, I think that considering the original Cabin Fever is kind of an underappreciated cult classic, I think if anything, the 2016 remake probably hurt the opinion of the original, because
imagine seeing that one first.
Yeah, and like would it
just having all like the gags spoiled for you, like without the humor,
but no gags, like just totally serious. Like, would it make you want to go back and see what the original?
No, it would ruin it.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Bad. Bad. That's no good. You can't do that.
Bad.
Don't recontextualize your film without doing like hard rewrites. Like you can't do that.
It's like there's no doubt that like the other kind of like attempted film remakes and reboots, the 2009 Friday the 13th and like
My Bloody Valentine,
Valentine, or Nightmare on Elm Street, like no doubt bad movies, but at least they tried something different from their source material.
Right, and like here's the thing. I could totally see a remake of Cabin Fever that is not funny being good. I see that as something you could do. You would have to completely rewrite all of the decisions made by your protagonists.
I would
like
say
you'd have to like actually make them feel like they're well written and like smart characters, or otherwise it would just be obnoxious.
I think they've already made that movie, and it's Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead remake.
Yes, which we should talk about at some point. I think that is
it's a pretty good remake.
It's
not amazing in my opinion, but it's pretty damn good.
I think this movie fits like a perfect lane of like exploitation in the same respects as something like Piranha's remake does.
Fantastic comparison.
And Eli Roth even has a cameo in that movie, but it's that embrace of camp.
Yeah.
Without being too winky nudgy about it. You can go silly and absurd for sure, but you don't have to just scream.
You don't
at
have
the
to break
audience,
the fourth
you know,
wall, right?
We're in on this.
Like, the absurdity is the self-awareness.
And I think that sense of camp is really underappreciated. You know, you look at the average ratings for a movie like Piranha 3D or this movie on, you know, IMDb, on Letterboxd, even critical reviews.
I think this movie's
they're
average
middling.
on IMDb is like 5.6 out
Yeah.
of 10, which is
Yeah.
like...
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I think it's really only now that it's tolerable to look back at that era, especially like for me. If I'd watched this film about 5 or so years ago, it might have been too cringy for me.
I
That's
totally
interesting.
disagree. I
because
totally disagree.
I first watched this movie in high school on VHS, and I loved it then.
Well, I mean, that was like the
know?
early aughts, like, right? Like at that time, or at least like
no, I'm
mid to
not
late,
that old.
Like, we're looking at
It's like
what,
early
2000
2010s.
Yeah, like 2010.
like 2010, 2011. Yeah.
Okay, I think like around that time. I don't know. Like I think like 2015 or so. Like I don't know. I look at that era and I cringe up so hard because that's like middle school for me. I don't know.
I saw this movie for the first time when I was in middle school, but if anything, as I've gotten older, I've learned to appreciate it more because I've finally learned to understand like what's clever about it from like a filmmaking perspective.
Well, absolutely from a filmmaking perspective, but from your average perspective, which is the majority of where these reviews are coming from. I'm just trying to put any amount of sense
and
to this.
I think it's
Like,
it's
I
one of
love
those
this movie,
movies
like,
where
clearly,
it's
but-
very. I would almost say it's metamodern in some ways, where you know you could take it at the face value, dumb entertainment, but if you have like a more serious reading of it in comparison to other movies of the genre of the time, it becomes much more rich in a different way.
I think it's equally successful on both of those fronts, though. I think that's a good point to bring up.
I agree.
I think that as dumb fun, it's also extremely successful.
Yeah.
I think, honestly, rather than it just now being far enough separated from it that it's funny, which I completely disagree with, I think it's just that the reason people don't hold this film in the same kind of regard that like we do is I think for a lot of people, stupid equals bad.
Yeah,
And
I would agree with that.
And I think when they see dumb jokes like fucking Dr. Mambo's professor of being a dog faced and like the absolutely bonkers slow-mo scene where Dennis does like Karate Kid shit across the parking lot, screaming pancakes. Like people see that and they're like, that's dumb.
That's like Ben Stiller level stuff. Like I was
like,
so caught off guard by it in all the right ways.
And it's like, yeah, it's fucking stupid. There's no doubt about it. But it's supposed to be stupid. Like the stupidity is not a sign of it being bad. Like that is in and of itself the intention.
Yes.
That the absurdity is the point. I think that just like a lot of people will just look at stuff at face value and say, this is dumb, therefore it must be bad. A lot of times, bad movies happen when people are trying to be smart a lot of the time. Like how many fucking bad movies have we watched that are
Watchmen,
that are like so fucking so
there.
full of themselves, you know? Like think they're so intelligent and so cerebral. Like
There's something to be said about embracing stupidity sometimes and not trying to be too smart. You know, you can still play with genre. You can do stuff like that. You can play into tropes, but you don't have to have deep philosophical themes underlying everything.
I think even like with smart films, like sometimes the best way to approach it is less intellectually.
Absolutely.
Like and more like face value. A reasonable example being The Lighthouse, which has a lot of levity in it and we like goofy, almost comedic moments, you know. But for every one of those, there's some sort of like allegorical concept.
And I think part of the reason this movie works, where something like, I don't know, like Club Dread, for example, doesn't work, is Eli Roth has such an understanding of horror movies and horror genres and exploitation movies, that he can play off those tropes much better than, something that's going comedy first.
Yeah. I think that provides an entry to an interesting tangent that I will try to not take too far off, but just like looking at Eli Roth and his career and who he is as a filmmaker, I think in many ways Eli Roth has spent his career trying to be like the Quentin Tarantino of horror, sort of like the like film fanatic who educated himself by like watching movies rather than getting a formal education, who is interested in playing with form and with genre and doing it in very over the top ways. I mean, we even see his relationship to Quentin Tarantino, like he's in Inglourious Bastards, like they're friends, so I think in many ways, Eli Roth is sort of like trying to achieve that level of skill, but for horror, I think that he is overall much less successful than Tarantino. But you look at stuff like this and like Hostel, and I think that the comparisons to like Tarantino's early work, like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown and stuff, there's definitely parallels.
Well, and
there.
I think where Eli Roth comes short in all of the later movies is not his misunderstanding of genre. Like, I think the best parts of those other movies, like Green Inferno or Death Wish, is his understanding of those genres very well.
Yeah.
It's that he's not a great script writer. He's not the...
I don't even know if I agree with that, because like I think Cabin Fever and Hostel have pretty tight scripts. I think what it is with Eli Roth is I think that similarly to Fred Durst, we talked about how I mentioned The Fanatic earlier, is I just don't think that Eli Roth has adapted to the changing times particularly well. I think in many ways his more recent film output has been trying to do the same kind of stuff that he did early in his career, and that shit just doesn't fly the same way anymore. It doesn't work. Like, if you want to continue to maintain a sense of quality, you have to make sure that you are changing with the times.
Yeah.
You have to adapt. You have to grow.
And I don't,
and not stagnate.
And
like
I don't
Fred
think
Durst.
I don't think he particularly. Yeah, well, I would say I think even at his worst, Eli Roth is a better filmmaker than Fred Durst. But
well, and this movie is such lightning.
Not the highest compliment.
This movie
but it's
is
something.
such lightning in the bottle.
Yeah.
Where like it's the perfect marriage of like a certain time period and a tone of comedy where it feels almost effortless in its comedy, whereas like later stuff with the comedy, he tries to take the same themes and tone of something like Cabin Fever, and it just doesn't translate nowadays. It translates in Hostel somewhat because it is very close in time period. But the further you get out from that, the less that effortlessness stays.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, creating essentially a perfect film on your first try is a curse. Where do you go from there? How do you grow from that? I think that it happens.
Last year.
I mean,
so many examples of it happening.
Ari Aster and Robert Eggers and Jennifer
Jordan
Kent
Peele.
too, and Jordan Peele. But I mean, also all of those were only their second films,
Well,
and Eli Roth had made, I think, 2 really good films. So it's like, how do you?
Oh, I see where you're going now.
That's
Okay,
the
yeah.
funniest part, because he followed this up with Hostel,
Right.
which Beyond Us is widely considered his best. Hostel and Hostel 2 are like his calling cards in a lot of ways. But I think you make a really interesting point about these directors catching lightning in a bottle the first and maybe second time and trying to recreate that every time afterwards.
Yeah, it just depends on like how, like if they're trying to do the same thing over and over again, I don't think it works. I think if
you get diminishing returns.
If they continue to try new things and take risks, and that's why I have a little bit more faith in directors like Jordan Peele and Robert Eggers and Ari Aster, because I feel like all of their second films were an evolution from what they were doing the first time. It didn't feel like the same thing again. as long as they continue to like to go in that direction, like if you can start by setting the bar high, as long as you either stay on that level or go up. Like you just have set yourself a very, very high bar.
Just go in a radically different direction. Like look at David Robert Mitchell, who did It Follows, and then follows it up with
Under the Silver Lake,
which is radically different. But I like when directors go outside of their wheelhouse a little bit.
Totally. Don't get shoehorned. Or if you do, make sure you continue to do it damn well.
Yes.
Because, like, I think there are some directors who have been making variations on the same movie their entire career, but continue to pull it off just about every time.
Yes.
Tarantino is a very good example of that, I think. Aside from his mid-2000s slump, I think he's been doing a great job of making basically the same movie his entire career.
One last thing I wanted to talk about with this movie is the soundtrack.
Oh, yeah.
Oddly enough, Angelo Badalamenti did the soundtrack for this.
He's dope.
Which is wild. He did all of the Twin Peaks soundtrack. He's a big David Lynch guy. Did a lot of great soundtrack work. And it's always surprising seeing his name in the opening credits because you would not expect him to be on this movie at all. But I think it comes down to that almost Tarantino-esque love of filmmaking that Eli Roth has to like pull someone like that into
to go after somebody like Badalamenti. Yeah,
I have to say, and I really only mean this as a compliment. I don't remember any of the score in the movie. I just watched it. None of it caught me, and that's because I assume like it only enhanced the film. Like I bet no motifs, nothing like drew my attention away from the film towards the score itself. Like I just remember the film. Like I have, and that's rare for me. Like normally I'm very keyed into that.
It's not intrusive, but I do think that it does have some like at least it for me, and maybe it's just because I've seen it many times, but it has a very memorable sound. It does feel like kind of spooky backwoods. Like there's a lot of like banjo and out of tune fiddle and kind of stuff like that I think is very atmospherically consistent with the rest of the movie.
It intensifies a lot of the scarier moments in the movie.
Yeah.
Underneath when Bert is running from the rednecks is a great example of that. There's a spooky, like, almost atonal just drone going on, kind of building the intensity of the scene. It's great. Fun.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, the movie is very funny, but I think that it is tense when it needs to be. The comedy doesn't deflate the moments of horror, like
and I think the brutality of a lot of the gore really helps, carry that as well. When we go to Karen in the shed later on and see her basically without the skin on her face.
Yeah, the dog ate her face off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that sort of like inversely, like coming back around, like the humor does a really good job of keeping the brutality from feeling excessive or gratuitous. Whereas in Hostel, like even though it's funny, like it's part of that torture porn wave, the brutality is the point. But in Cabin Fever, no matter how much like brutality and gore there is, there's so much lightheartedness in the gags that it's hard to stay feeling uncomfortable. I think that the balance between the two is really good. It's not a one-note film. It does tension and horror really well, and it does comedy very well. Time to rate, boys?
I think so.
Yeah.
Ben, this was your pick, so why don't you start?
Okay, well, Cabin Fever is a classic, in my opinion. I love this movie so much. I think it hits a perfect balance of humor and horror that not many movies do. It has such an embrace of camp in a sense that's very rare nowadays. And I think it's criminally underappreciated. This is a 5 for me. This is a near perfect movie.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think that it's definitely Eli Roth's best film. It's one of the best horror satires ever, especially of its era. It's such a perfect time capsule of the tropes of the early 2000s. And no matter how many times I see it, I always laugh at the same gags every time. Like, and that really, really speaks well for the sort of sticking power of this movie. I wish more people loved it the way I did. It's gonna be a 5 for me as well.
Well, fortunately, someone else today developed a love for this film.
Nice.
That isn't you. So, hooray!
Woo!
You won. You get a prize, and that prize is a 5 from me as well.
Golden
For
Pod.
all the reasons y'all said.
Hell yes, the latest inductee into the hallowed halls of the Golden Pods is Cabin Fever with a unanimous perfect rating. If you've stuck around this long and you still haven't seen the original Cabin Fever, go out and watch it. Like,
Yeah,
please.
there's so much we didn't unpack because it would be silly to. Like, the film does a great job of displaying it.
We don't do the film any favors by trying to explain every gag. Like,
No.
go watch it, and whatever you do, make sure that you're not watching the 2016 one.
Yes.
Do not
Christ.
watch Cabin Fever 2016. Cabin Fever 2003.
You'll know pretty quickly.
Well, next week is my pick.
Indeed.
And I was planning on doing something else quarantine related, keeping the theme going along, but
The theme of the teen quarantine. Yikes! Whoopsies!
sadly,
Tine. Anyway.
tragedy struck a few days ago at the time of recording, and we lost a true legend. Stuart Gordon died at the age of 72 recently. And so to honor Stuart Gordon, I think that it's only fitting that we cover one of his classics, and it's going to be one that I shamefully have not seen yet. The easy choice would have been Reanimator, but I love Reanimator, and we'll do that at some point. But instead, we're going to cover From Beyond, based on the H.P. Lovecraft story of the same name. We'll talk more about Stuart Gordon next week, but fucking R.I.P.
Yeah, I'm excited. I haven't seen From Beyond either, but I do have a fun fact. It was produced by a little studio called Full Moon.
Full Moon Studios!
It was one of their first, actually. Same studio that brought us Ginger Dead Man.
Oh, word.
Excellent. Was Brian Usna attached to From Beyond? I know he was on Reanimator and he worked with Stuart Gordon a lot.
Yes, he was a producer, along with Charles Band, who, of course, is the Full Moon guy.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm excited for From Beyond next week. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but never the whole thing. And I think what better way to honor a true real one, Stuart Gordon. So check back with us next week. Maybe it'll take your mind off the quarantine and take it to some place beyond. Speaking of the beyond, Cleveland, what has the sponsor shelf granted us this week?
Deep within the sorrows of our immeasurable pain, deep within that well of abyssal torment that seeps out from our very souls, that slowly pools out from our being and saturates our environments and those even that we love around us. Try Granny Humpledink's bean bars and get your mind off of all that bad, all that sorrow that comes from within that we can't really codify, we can't really refer to by any name other than just the deep darkness of the soul, that wretched abyss that torments for all eternity, even after we're gone. We know it will still linger in others that we've harmed in our lives. That wretched pain. Just make it all go away with Granny Humpledink's bean bars. There you go.
Granny Humpledink's. It's hard to be mean with a mouth full of bean.
Thanks, Granny Humpeldink.
All right, that'll do it for this week's episode. If you like the show, make sure to head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this right now. And if you can leave a rating, do it. Make it all of the stars. As many of them as there are.
Just like we gave Cabin Fever.
All of them. Yep. Put us into the golden pod hall.
Of your heart.
Of your heart. And don't forget to leave a nice review as well with some kind or unkind words. You can be mean if you want, as long as the rating is 5 stars.
We're just so lonely from quarantine. Any messages at this point would be wonderful.
It's important to social distance, but not on social media. Speaking of which, you can follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. Let us know, have you seen Cabin Fever before, and do you like it, or are you one of those doofuses who thinks it's dumb?
You doofus.
You dingus. Or you can also follow us on letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod, where you can see a list of all the films we've talked about on the show with our average ratings and links to those episodes.
We've talked about a lot.
And you can also traverse the ever-growing halls of the Golden Pods, where you will see Cabin Fever placed upon a pedestal alongside many other perfect films. You can follow me on Twitter at Deep State Aussie.
I'm on Twitter at Mr. Sheets. Follow me for some primo Animal Crossing content.
And I am occasionally tweeting for Light Arc Studios as we push out our wonderful, lovely, dovely game. It stares back. That's It Stares Back. And I've actually been tweeting a little bit lately, guys. For once, I've actually been tweeting some arts that I've been cooking up for the old game. Yeah, and you can also, of course, find this old game on Steam. Once again, just It Stares Back. It'll show up. I promise you. And also join our Discord, the It Stares Back Discord, via our website at lightarcstudio.com. And you can also check out some of those lovely, dovely arts on my art station at Cleveland Mosier. Just search Cleveland Mosier Art Station, either on Art Station or on Google. It'll show up. You know how the Google box works. If you don't, I don't know how you got to this podcast. I really don't. But yeah, that about sums it up. I'm open for commissions right now as well. So if you want some cool arts done, hit me up. I might be able to paint you a spooky picture.
Yeah, definitely check out Cleveland's work and hit him up for a commish. Times are tough for everybody, but especially artists. So if for some reason you are not affected financially by all of the bullshit that's going on, which if you are, totally understandable.
Can relate.
But yeah, commission Cleveland to do some art for you. You won't be disappointed. The quality is good. I can vouch. All right, well, next week from beyond, and who knows where our souls will be after another week in quarantine.
They'll be full with the love of Granny Humpeldink.
And pancakes.